Hey everyone, thanks for being here. Thank you for having this panel happen. So welcome to the Women's Juggling Forum. That's a play on World Juggling Federation, in case you didn't know, and if you don't know about them, look it up. So who am I? My name is Josie May. I use she or they pronouns. I'm a queer juggler. I've been juggling clubs for 8 years. I work in the realm of social circus and utilize trauma-informed care, anti-oppressive, strength-driven practices in my work with youth. I am calling from the Chinook, Multnomah, Clackamas, Tualatin lands, also known as Portland, Oregon. And this is the Women's Juggling Forum. We have 4 amazing women on our panel today, and we're going to answer some questions and just talk about accessibility, equability, and feminism and women in juggling. So a little bit about how this panel formed. It's become more and more talked about how juggling and flow arts are communities of access and privilege. We don't exist in this vacuum beyond the systems of oppression that happen in our country. A lot of times we hold this mentality of everyone is accepted and anyone can learn how to juggle, which is true, but can they if they don't see themselves represented in communities, if they're experiencing harassment or microaggressions in the virtual world and in-person events? If you can't buy props or even approach topics that you live with in your daily life that just aren't seen here because of privilege. So this isn't a new topic for many of us, but having these discussions in the juggling community is becoming more and more accepted. I taught a Women in Juggling workshop at Packfire, Shape Summit, and Club Congress. And Kevin reached out to me about this panel for Club Fest. So thank you, Kevin, and thank you, organizers. It's been a really fun weekend, and I really appreciate it. So within all of this, we're going to talk about a lot of terminology, and I think it's super important we're all on the same page about what certain terms mean, especially making it accessible to some people who maybe have never heard the same term, and so we're all speaking a similar language. So I'm going to post in the group chat a little Google Doc of some terminology we're going to be using. Feel free to reference that throughout. Feel free to Google, search some of those words. It was kind of just our introduction words, a sentence or two about what these acronyms and concepts mean. So, what's included? Why are you here? Maybe you're just in the Zoom room. And if you are, hello, hi, welcome. You're gonna learn about intersectional feminism, yay. Maybe you're here because then you get to tell people you attended, and that might make you feel good, and other people might think better of you. You also get an opportunity here for self-reflection on your place in the world. You're getting permission to own your knowledge and admit to mistakes, which I think is very powerful. What's not included, we don't have easy answers. We don't have easy fixes, no Band-Aids, no absolution, I'm sorry. I cannot absolve you. But we are here to talk, and this is really a space for viewers to listen. We're accepting some questions through the chat, and if something comes up, let us know. There are restrictions for cis men because this is a space not for them, and that's important. And if you don't know what cisgender means, it means your gender identity matches that the sex you were assigned at birth. So this is not a space for the chat to kind of dominate. It's kind of a discussion panel and lots of listening. But if questions do come up, you know, there's a difference between having a question that is coming from a place of wanting to learn and a difference of being a troll or having kind of nothing like nice to say. So identify between the two. You can submit questions in the chat or use the raise hand feature. You can also, please stay muted. Thank you. And we have some moderators here in the background who are monitoring and checking for all of that. Also, no tone policing, which basically is a way to detract from validity of statements by attacking the tone in which it's presented. So you might hear emotional statements, and that's okay. So as we get more into this, just take everyone a second to kind of ground into your space where you are. If you're feeling like you're slunched over, maybe pull your shoulders back. Take some breaths in and out. And something we're going to talk about is managing the contraction that can happen in these kinds of conversations. A huge part of anti-oppressive work is getting comfortable with the feeling of being uncomfortable. So you might feel a contraction of like, ouch, or oh, that hurt, or that's not fair, not all men. And these things are totally normal. And a huge part is leaning into that space, breathing, identifying, wow, that was not okay for me. Why? You know, kind of going a little bit deeper and seeing where that's rooted from. So you may experience some of those contractions throughout this panel for the next hour. You're gonna be okay. Great. So that's enough intro. I would like to introduce our panelists. So our panelists are amazing. First up, we have Lucy. Lucy is an entertainer based in Atlanta. She has been juggling for 14 years and is passionate about creating a juggling community that is welcoming for everyone. She is a trans and queer artist and advocate who uses juggling, burlesque, and personal narrative to promote LGBTQ visibility. We have Michaela, an Oakland transplant originally from the Midwest, NB femme who has been juggling for about 4 years, flowing for about 10. 'Tis but a baby juggler, but excited to be here. Mel is currently residing in Boulder, Colorado. She first picked up props in 2010 through the group Berserkus in Isla Vista, California, and became involved with the Santa Barbara Fire Conclave. Through flow arts, she also found her aerial, contortion, and acrobatics practice. She is a graduate student in geophysics, and in the pre-coronavirus world, she performed burlesque, aerial, and fire under her stage name, Millionaire. Sonal, former international street performer turned MC, turned stand-up comedian. Sonal Agarwal is now based in Chicago. She is an actor, comedian, producer, and movement artist. When she's not on stage, she is teaching and practicing Thai massage. Her one-woman show, The Alchemy of Bliss, played a sold-out weekend at the Steppenwolf Theater. She also teaches and performs in Spanish. You can hear all about her in her podcast, Rani Rage Radio. Rani means queen in Hindi. Okay, so first question, we're gonna kind of talk about some history. And this is directed towards Lucy and is open for the rest of the panel. But Lucy, I would love to hear more about the history of women in juggling.
Awesome, hi. So first in the discussion of history of juggling, I have to highly recommend Tom Wall's book, The History of Juggling from Antiquity to the Middle Ages. A lot of the stuff that I'm gonna talk about are things that, most jugglers who are interested in juggling history might know about, but there was so much more in Tom's book than I ever found. So if you like juggling history, I kind of am a big nerd about it, and his book is so good. But sort of the short, summary here is women are all over juggling history. Right? The Egyptian tombs, definitely that's all girls juggling. There's Roman and Italian art of early female jugglers. The Greeks, who were apparently lit, had male and female jugglers who danced naked over swords and spit fire while singing about dicks. So like that's a cute scene. And you can learn a lot more from like that book that I mentioned about sort of those specific traditions. There's also like you know, Turks and early like Jewish culture all had lots of juggling, and there is representation of women in juggling in like every historical context, basically. I want to kind of just touch on the thing that's really most fascinating to me, which a lot of jugglers might already be familiar with, but maybe this is new to you. But the Polynesian community of Tonga has a tradition of exclusively female jugglers that is part of their like origin story and their deities, right? So they play a game called haiko, which is juggling these nuts and fruits, almost always in a shower pattern and almost always just women. And it's tied to their mythology of Haikule, the goddess of the underworld. So she ruled the underworld, lived exclusively with women, and if anyone approached the gates to the underworld, she would pluck out their eyes, and she and her like girlfriends would juggle their eyes like as a joke. Isn't that hilarious? Which is pretty awesome. There's also a spirit who's sort of like important in Tonganese culture that's also related to this haiko game, and it's the spirit of Fehuluni, who is gender fluid. She would appear as a woman to men or as a man to woman, sort of like at her whim. She lived in the underworld with these other women, so I'll use she pronouns for her, but they would also work. And it's really, like, as a trans person, finding out that there is a deity who is, like, trans and a juggler all together, it was just, like, it kind of blew my mind. Even though, like, I'd heard of haiko, I knew that, like, in Tonga, all these women juggle, right? But that it's so ingrained in their culture and that it's so tied to this idea of gender as a more inclusive thing than just this like binary notion that we think about it as. The other really cool thing about like the haiko game, and specifically about this spirit Fehuluni, she was just also associated with strong sexual urges. And the game of haiko itself was considered like beautiful, right? It was considered a display of grace and femininity, and like the graceful actions of the wrist was seen as like a way to highlight women's beauty, right? So it's an interesting thing to me that a lot of times juggling is not framed as like a feminine act, it's framed as more of a masculine act, right? Like I've had people say like, oh, why do you juggle like clubs, not hoops, right? And this idea that like, oh, juggling is not like inherently feminine, right? We have evidence that it definitely is, and it's also like tied to this expression of sexuality. The last little point that I want to make here is, so this Tongan culture of juggling was related to the goddess of the underworld, right? And so when colonial forces in like the West first encountered this culture, they like Christian missionaries rewrote Polynesian mythology to make the goddess of the underworld a god of the underworld. So there are some accounts where Haikuli, the goddess of the underworld, is a guy, right? So we have this attempt by the like patriarchal establishment to disempower women, and to like erase this genderqueer spirit, right? So I don't want to like say like, oh, patriarchy always does this. They try to like put a box on things, but they kind of do, right? And so in the same ways that we see cultures that celebrate gender diversity get put like that mythology squished down, right? Like the ancient Talmud in the Jewish religions had like a half dozen different genders, right? All these other cultures that we can look at had space for more genders. There's also like this diversity of juggling experience that's also kind of like that history's gotten pushed down, right? So it's maybe a loose link that looms large in my mind because I care a lot about like, how do we express gender and like what is the history of juggling? And so this, I don't want to go like too far off on a tangent, but like just know that historically there is space for women to juggle. There is space for non-binary people to juggle. There's tons of different things that we have always called juggling. So you don't have to like just throw and catch balls or clubs or, you know, whatever prop to be considered a valid juggler.
Awesome. Yeah, definitely. Thank you for all of that history. I think that's a really important aspect of, you know, where we're at with looking at other cultures that influence the craft that we do, looking at the history of people who have been doing this before us. Oh, yay. Awesome. And I think that kind of moves into our, well, I guess one reflection question I have is, you know, how can this history inform our community now? And what are things we can do to further research and learn? I don't know if I'm asking that to the panel, but just to think about.
I'll just say one more thing is like, what learning this stuff has done for me personally is it has encouraged me to try to make my juggling very clear, make my juggling very an expression of femininity, an expression of sexuality, right? It's hard to think of juggling as sexy, but like there's historical evidence for it. So like make your juggling sexy, right?
Hell yeah. Definitely. So let's move in now to kind of a bigger question for the panel. It's about aiming for allyship. I've gotten a lot of responses from people of like, okay, we hear, we're listening, there are issues in our community. How do we, what's happening with the speaker view? Sweet. So yeah, so let's talk about a couple specifics about what is allyship. How do we create these more inclusive spaces? And so a question I have for the panel is, what does a safer space look like to you? And the reason we're using safer is because it's impossible to create a safe space for everyone. There's no way that we can meet every single person's needs at once, but we can create a safer space, a place where it's safe for everyone to be unsafe. This is also sometimes referred to as brave space, where we show up bravely in our knowledge and in the knowledge that we don't know everything. So yeah, so my question is, what does a safer space look like to you? Sonal, do you want to start?
Hey friends, what's happening? So nice to see everybody. Um, we're all sensitive ass people. And I love that a safe space is a space to be unsafe. Because if we look at these optics, for example, this is supposed to be a diversity panel. There are 5 of us, and we have 2 whites on the panel. We really have a lacking of diversity. And I mean, I really, really appreciate the allyship. Look, see, I feel like I have to defend myself even then. Like it sounds like a problem, but just to share something of my experience, I was at EJC in Athens, what was that, like 2007 or something? And then it's EJC Toulouse, which is 5 or 6 years later. And I will often have people coming up to me like, were you that one Indian girl at the juggling convention in 2007, 2008, whatever it was? And it's like, yeah, because there was no other one. It had to have been me. And I don't really have anyone to be safe to discuss my experience. Like, there's over 1 billion people that look like me. Why aren't any of them? What is happening? What systems are in place that are invisible? Because when people think of privilege, they think, how am I benefiting from my what am I getting from that? So privilege isn't necessarily something that you have. It's something that other people don't have. And I'm very aware of my privilege, the audacity to believe that I can do something, the being cool with looking dumb in public, and dropping shit and picking it up. That's really vulnerable to make mistakes. So even to do that, and I mean, like, I'm not trying to rip on anybody, but the very first thing that I saw in the comments when I came in, somebody else is performing and somebody put in the chat, like, I can do that move. And my experience of bro, it's really hard to invite people into vulnerable spaces. And I think, fellas, I'm sure that you're looking around and are like, we would love for there to be more women here in general, not just because women are dope, but why is it such a bro zone? So I don't know if that's really answering the question, but I'm here for this discussion. And it's like, it's 2020, and I don't remember there ever being like a women or diversity panel. And I'm really grateful for this. They're very difficult conversations to have. So let's get to it.
Definitely, and we're really grateful to have you here as well with us. Michaela or Mel, do you want to respond to that?
I will just briefly speak on it because I think Sonal made some really great points, and just wanting to reiterate that when we speak about a safe space, I like to come with the mentality that, that safe space is kind of an illusion, that generally if you're looking at minorities or certain demographics, that generally we've lived our life existing in a space where we are conditioned to preserve the safe space mentality and the fragility of other people who generally don't look like us. So in any given event or moment or space where particularly a lot of flow people or jugglers come together, while it seemingly feels like it's, a community and we're all here for this and we're all really into it, there's definitely some subsections that if you're not actively taking the time to consciously think about what that looks like for the people around you who don't look like you, and how that makes them feel or how that can make them feel, that it's not necessarily actively participating in a safe space just because you're together with people that like to do the same activity as you. And that I've also very much had experiences like Sonal, not so much pertaining to juggling, but having gone to a few flow events and retreats, and during our welcomes and saying hellos, that I have the very anxiety I have anxiety because I sit and I look around me and I look for folks that look like me, and generally I will be one of the very few, usually one or two, if anything. And what's a little concerning is I'm very light. I have a lot of privilege being able to say I am light skinned, and that does a lot, as it shouldn't. But to then look around and not see anyone who's darker than me, or anyone who's even relatively close to being brown or non-binary or female in general. I still identify with being feminine, but women in particular, and then women of color, are just very lacking in a lot of scenes, and the representation is very far and in between. So keeping a mindful, conscious stream of I need to be more aware of the things that affect folks that don't look like me, as a white and or cis being. So I will let Mel give some very, very good insight and bow out here. That's my spiel.
So I actually will probably just talk about it in very, very more broad terms, because you and Sonal made some really good points on the specifics already, and I feel like I couldn't really say it better. For me, like, I guess, like, the very, very basics of whether or not being in a certain space with other people feels safer versus less safe for me personally is, am I the only woman there? Like, am I the only female presenting person there? And the more other women there are, the more comfortable I feel, because it does feel less safe to have like a bigger ratio of people who I feel like can't necessarily relate to me in certain ways, so that if something were to happen that was upsetting for me, like, are there other people there that I would be able to go to and who could relate and who could, like, say that they've had similar experiences and be there to, like, talk to, like, even just talking to somebody else, even if they didn't see it firsthand or if they've never had it happen to them, just like having that person listen and be like, yeah, I can feel where you're coming from. I can relate to you and I like empathize with you. That's super important to me, to have safety in that space. And if that element is lacking, then, you know, I'm probably gonna like want to ditch out of there faster.
Totally. Something that makes me think about, and I'm curious the panel's perspective on this, is like, okay, there's a lack of diversity at our events. Let's give more tickets to BIPOC flow artists or jugglers.
Does everybody know what a BIPOC is? There's a lot of terms. I mean, white people went and fucked everything up, and now we have to have like a bunch of terms, right?
I'll
So
type it in the
what's
chat.
BIPOC again?
Black, Indigenous, person of color.
Okay. I thought we were just POCs, but now there's like BIPOC, QPOC, CPOC, DPOC.
Totally. I can't speak to that too much other than thinking about the intersections.
You're doing great, Josie.
Identity.
She knows all the words. Thank.
Well, it just makes me think about like, okay, so we're gonna have stipend tickets, or we're gonna have a scholarship tickets for persons of color at our event. And I think, like, I have a perspective on that. I'm just curious, like, how the panel feels about that, and if that is like actually creating more accessible spaces.
I mean, in Chicago, there's a really fun Monday Armory space, and there's a Taco Tuesday that Austin Orion is such an angel, and I've very much tried to bring my Black and brown people, and it's tough. it's tough because they come and they kind of like tiptoe in, and it's a park. We're in a park. We're outside, and he's making food for everybody. And it still is like, this is a lot of white people. You do a lot of white people shit. And it's like, no, it's movement. It's movement. It's juggling. And it's like, it's pulling teeth, you know, to get people into these spaces. And next.
It definitely helps kind of fill the gap, just at a very ground level, making things more accessible. When we look at the economic difference between POCs generally, sorry, my dog just nosed my laptop. You take a look at the money factor just as a whole, it does make a huge difference to make those things a little more financially accessible. It does, I would say it would help quite a bit, like probably more than we really think it would.
Mel?
In the interest of getting to the other topics, I'm going to pass on this one so that I'm not repeating what everybody else is saying.
Oh,
cool. Yeah. Oh yeah, go ahead, Lucy.
I just want to say one of the things that I find like very encouraging is some of the work that I've been seeing from the IJA that I think Aaron Stevens is really spearheading. So like the regional championships that are happening like all over the globe. To me, it's so wonderful to see that diversity of jugglers that like from an international perspective. Right, so seeing like y'all watch the jugglers from Chile, they're insane.
That's a lot of women.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, right. So like when we empower women to have larger roles in our community, like that leads to this greater diversity, and that's just a really beautiful thing. So I would love to see ways to make that happen in a larger way. So how can we get those regional champions, like how can we expose them directly and have them brought to our festivals and like sponsor those performers to come?
Totally. And all of our panel, we're in America, and I think there's very specific considerations in America and with race and gender and our community. And so I definitely see like incorporating the international aspect, like Aaron Stevens has done so much work drawing together people and having these international regional competitions across the world. So hot take, pay them. Yep. So yeah,
let's not get wild. I mean, yeah, I'd love to get funding to get more POCs into these spaces. And yeah, Mike's it's very different, the international scene to the national phenomenon of the bro zone.
Totally.
Not as broy in Europe, guys. Right?
So to move on, just because we have more questions, something we want to talk about is what are some values you would like to see embraced in the community, specifically around reaction to and treatment of unsafe people? We got a question in the chat, specifically like what guidelines would you suggest Facebook group moderators implement to make online forums a safer space for women and gender non-conforming people? This is a really broad question, but maybe if we can focus in on some of like the values around how we can support the community in our reaction to and treatment of unsafe people.
So I'm happy to talk about it first. I personally would love to just see people being held accountable, and that should be regardless of what their position in the social hierarchy is, right? Because there's abusers everywhere, and you can have someone who is really visible and is like, quote unquote, in a position of power, Like maybe they're an instructor, maybe they're an organizer for these community events. That doesn't exclude them from being able to be an abuser. And arguably, if someone is in a position of power over other people, they have the potential to hurt more people more deeply. They can leverage their power, for example. So I think that there's definitely some overlap in like people in those positions and people who also cause harm to others. I don't think that just because someone's in an organizer or an instructor position, that makes them exempt from hurting others. And they are an example to other people. So if we're giving them passes for their behavior that's not actually acceptable, we're giving passes to other people to be like them.
I would like to quickly piggyback off of that and just broad statement, speak up. For sure, there are some instances where when we're talking about allyship, where your voice should definitely not be the one making the point or trying to defend things. But at the end of the day, when it comes down to it, if you see something that is wrong, if you see something that feels like it could go wrong, or you see someone being attacked for nonsensical reasons, speak up. It is a matter of letting these people know that we as a community, that we as people do not accept this behavior and that it is not okay. The best thing you can do is squash it in its tracks.
Yeah, I will. Oh, Lucy, go ahead.
I was going to say, so speak up, especially within your peer group, right? So like if you are a cis white man and you see a cis white man doing some shit that you know is wrong, like you're the person who has the most influence and opportunity to check that person, right? So like you have privilege, you need to use it within your peer group to help like create the space that you know other people need.
I've heard this a lot from people where it's like, oh, I'm a non-confrontational person. And I appreciate that, you know, like that's the, yeah, it's tough. And I think the more conversations I have with people, it's confrontation is then, you know, we're awakening our own stuff and triggering our own stuff. So it's, we all have a lot of unprocessed grief, unprocessed trauma. So we don't know what we're triggering in each other. So, I mean, hold yourself accountable, you know, like, I mean, I can be an unsafe space. And then I want to communicate with people like, hey, what's going on with you? And try not to be these, it's all easy to talk about, but then it's, I mean, it's difficult to talk about, but then to put into practice is pretty complicated. So how do we, you know, like growing up when you would hear about like 1 out of 3 women are assaulted or whatever, you know, it'd be like, do those dudes ever talk to each other? Do those dudes ever have the opportunity to be like, hey bro, I did something that I really shouldn't have, and I need to clear this. And if that's in a form of, you know, creating groups with each other, creating, women have the luxury and the liberty of being like, I'm doing a new moon ceremony, and I'm doing a women's circle, and I'm doing a circle of feelings, and a feelings seminar, you know, versus dudes. I don't know if you get to do that stuff. You don't get to do that stuff. So whatever that you can do to create spaces for all of us, whatever we can do to create spaces to hold ourselves accountable, you know, and we just want to brush over stuff, but we don't, and thank you, Rich. It is happening slowly. And that's why this panel is so important. Yeah, I think we need to, because it gets really tough to then like, who is the behavior police? Who's in charge? You know, we're all in this together. We're all works in progress together, and we're all evolving together. And maybe my version of what's true and right is limited because I haven't heard this perspective over here. And then I'm like, okay, I didn't think about it like that. Let's all listen to each other.
I'd also like to say that leaving the educating to the minority or the oppressed group is exhausting. To push that mental load onto the folks that are dealing with that harassment, those microaggressions, the unwanted passes, to leave that in their hands while they're also physically and mentally dealing with these things on generally a daily basis is just not acceptable. It's not acceptable to expect that we take on all of this shit, just this heavy shit every day within all of our communities and expect us to sit there and be jolly and want to teach you and show you the wrong in your ways. It is a responsibility, an individual responsibility, A, to educate yourselves, and B, to apply that in any daily practice that you have.
And you can always ask for our Venmo links. Do that shit. Do that shit.
Yes, I agree with all of that so much. I also think about, oh gosh, I lost my train of thought. Something that stood out to me from what Michaela was saying was jokes and, you know, speaking up and doing that, Lucy added, like in your peer circle with the people you're surrounded with. I'm linking in the chat an iceberg of white supremacy, and maybe you've seen this going around on social media, but it talks about kind of the more covert white supremacist ideas, like it's just a joke, or you know, like all of that, which is covert and it's under the covers. Like you don't think about this. You know, when we think about white supremacy, we think of extremists, we think of the KKK, neo-Nazi groups, we think of that, but white supremacy is an ideology that as a white person living in the United States, you are benefiting from that, regardless if you make racist jokes or not. It's ever present in our institutional and cultural assumptions, and it assigns value, morality, goodness, and humanity to the white group while casting other people less than that. So as a white person, whites, we all have work to do on this, and just kind of expanding the idea that it's not just like these extreme things you hear about, it's covert in our culture. And speaking out with your groups, with the people that you're close to when you see something, and taking that labor off the people who are dealing with it day in and day out, and don't have a choice in that, I think is really important. Yeah, does anyone have anything else to add to that question? Values, you know, especially now that everything's online, treatment of people in groups and online spaces.
So,
That's a, oh,
sorry, go ahead, Lucy.
I said groups are a really important place, and you know, there's been a lot of controversy in the last few years about like what is our behavior in juggling groups, and people who want juggling groups to be just about posting videos or like just about the juggling, right? And like that's not how we create a community that makes space for everyone, right? And so when those conversations happen, being loud about what you need, not just for yourself, but for other people in your community, and calling out the moderators who delete posts or silence and stop conversations, and kind of like sticking to those guns and making sure that those things happen that's like pretty important to me.
Totally.
Yeah, and so building off of something that Arlene had put into the chat a little bit earlier, something that I would love to see, it happens on a smaller scale, I guess, but something I would love to see a more widespread and organized system for would be the reporting of misbehavior, which like right now, in my experience, that does happen within self-organized subgroups within the community, who, you know, like subgroups who take it upon themselves to actually address these issues and to keep track of shit, and you know, warn other people if someone's being unsafe or whatnot. And as far as I know, there isn't really like a more universal or well-organized method of doing this across the community in general. But it is something that I would love to see more. I don't know what that would look like, but I would like to see it normalized.
Definitely.
I mean, and it doesn't have to be necessarily like combative, you know, accountability. And it doesn't like there are places in the world where it's like, okay, we got some shit going on, let's like play some drums together and dance it out furiously, you know. And I mean, some of my most powerful, the thing about this community is movement based, right? And my most powerful teachers are people that I don't even speak the same spoken language with, you know. And there's a person named Sardar in Turkey that he don't speak no English, but he is my double staff teacher and he is my staff teacher. And it was because we speak this language of movement. And there are such incredible things in this community that, you know, there are universal languages being spoken. So let's try to do. I'm always really overwhelmed when I come into a workshop and it's like, all right, well, we're going to go ahead and get into the planes and you guys know about the directions and we also have the timings. So let's do the timings and then the directions. I'm like, whoa, what, I'm so up here now and I need to come into here. So how can we be in our bodies, you know, with this whole pursuit of bliss and flow? There's a lot of value in the dissonance and the discomfort. And if you can give space for that in whatever form, you know, meditation, dancing, you know, punching at stuff or something, you know, so that you can return to your highest vibrational self, then think about the people that you know that are no longer part of this community and why that is. You know, I know a lot of people who are like over it, and you know, that's, for me, that's sad. I think they've gone on to do other things, but what can we do to make this stronger?
Definitely. Yeah, I totally feel you on like the headiness of it. And, you know, I think in the US we have this kind of like romanticization of the stylistic dance jugglers who are doing their like creative, like big movement stuff. And it's just funny that we're like, why is American juggling so versus the kind of more stylistic things that, at least from my perspective, I see a lot more in Europe. And I also think that, you know, being a part of multiple communities, being a part of a queer community in Portland, being a part of dance communities, actor communities, movement communities, like many of us have other communities that we're part of. And so it can feel like coming back to the flow art scene, the juggling scene where we're not having these conversations is just exhausting. It's like, I'm not going to do this work here. And so thank you everyone who is here doing that and working for a change in that. I think it's really important. So we have about 12 minutes. I think the last topic we wanted to touch on was kind of the future of these panels and initiatives. So who are some people you look up to who are making changes in the community and why? And what excites you about the future of these panels and discussions?
I'll touch on that initially just because I'm holding something from one of Sunil's comments, but kind of tying into the fact that movement within itself is a world-renowned language. It's something that we can all kind of understand. So what I am excited about is there is so much potential in this community. One, because I can see all of these faces. The fact that everyone has shown up here today to have this discussion or listen shows that there is progress happening slowly, but it's happening, and that is important. And two, the opportunity. We have the means to make this tool, this movement, this thing that we all like to do, something that really intertwines us and brings us together and really makes this a community where we all feel welcome and happy to be, which is amazing. The fact that we have folks like all of you who are willing to try to start putting in that footwork and making it happen. In general, I'd like to just people who inspire me. I live in the Bay Area. There's so many good jugglers here, like so many good jugglers. And I've been so lucky that a lot of them are very, very friendly. And I've had the privilege and opportunity to juggle with Amy, who I see in the chat here. And, you know, in those instances, for someone who's at like a higher level, I would expect folks like that to be like, you know, I don't want to juggle with people who aren't at my level, and I don't want to teach you things, and that's fine. But, you know, I'm met with grace, and I'm met with the opportunity to learn, in particular from her. It has been a wonderful experience that I've had, just because I don't have a lot of female jugglers in my life, which is a shame. But you know, just the folks around me, and you know who you are. I get to watch all of you like do your thing on a daily basis, and it inspires me a lot, and you're all very welcoming, and that's what I want to see projected in our community. I want to see folks want to teach each other and want to learn and want to just be there with one another. And I think that's something that we really have the ability and capability to do here, and I'm very excited to see where this continues and how it grows.
Lucy, or
well, I was gonna say one of the things that is just so inspiring to me is like every time I see a video from the Circus Afghan account where it's like these little girls juggling 5 clubs, my heart just soars. Like if y'all don't follow that account, go check it out. It's amazing. And like I think that is the kind of stuff that we as a juggling community should really be trying to like support, encourage, uplift, because like that's what it's about, right? Like for so many of us, juggling has given us this path to a better like version of ourselves, right? Like I'm trans. I came out like after I'd been in the juggling community for 10 years, and like juggling itself as an action helped me feel like I had like agency in my life. And so it's this movement that requires us to show up. It requires us to use our bodies and our brains. And when we apply that to others and apply that to our community, that movement and action is really powerful. So that's the stuff that's inspiring me. And like thanks to like Aaron Stevens and Taylor Glenn have done like really cool things. So like let's just like get more of that. Let's all run for IJA board and like take over and make it awesome.
Mel, do you want to say anything? Otherwise, I was gonna say something.
Well, I definitely think that one thing that excites me is the increased frequency that we're having these types of conversations in a broader and more public setting within the community. And I am really happy that I got to participate in this. I also got to participate in the Kinetic Diversity panel, and just I look forward to having these conversations more and having people's voices elevated, because if you're not talking about it, then like nothing's going to change. No learning is going to happen. So I really look forward to seeing more of these things. And I also just wanted to reinforce the idea that even though this work is important work, we shouldn't just be expected to do it all the time, and we shouldn't be expected to just do it for free, because it's energetic work. It's our time and energy. And I just hope that people see diversity discussions in the same kind of light that they see, like, you know, trick workshops, for example, because it's all part of the same thing. And God forbid we have, you know, in-person events ever again. I would love to see these types of discussions at an in-person event and see who's physically showing up there, because it's one thing to, you know, click on a link and go to this free thing online when you're stuck at home. and maybe you can even remain anonymous, but I would love to see like who would actually show up to this if it happened in person.
Oh yeah, and I would love to hear who's like, I was at this women's juggling panel, so I'm a feminist. Like if you feel like that's a cool thing to say, maybe may play that out a little bit. And as purveyors of play, let's invite each other to play rather than challenge each other. I've brought people into a flow event. I feel like it's a very American phenomenon to be like, what do you do? What tricks can you do? Show me what you can do. Versus, oh, you play? Let's play. Let's play. Let's be silly, because all my South American juggler dudes and all the Frenchy juggler dudes, the Frenchy are bougie, but they're the Italians are super silly. You can tell them. You can tell. I will come. They can come for me. I will fight all of the French jugglers. They're bougie, but they're fun. They're silly. They're super silly, and so are the French. And I don't know what it is about Americans, but it is very like, so let's invite each other to play. That's my big takeaway. You don't have to prove anything, like, oh, you got clubs, what can you do? I always felt that here, where I felt it's like, does she even juggle, or is she just walking around talking shit? Let people walk around and talk shit if they want to, whatever.
Awesome. Any other thoughts?
Yeah, competition is a big part of this paradigm, and competition is good. It pushes us to excel to levels that we never, but remember, we're not in competition with each other. We are colleagues. We're collaborators. We're all on the same team.
There's a great documentary, I think it's from BBC, called Century of the Self, that talks about how this cult of the self and individualism like took root and took over like Western culture post World War I, World War II. If you're into like, why is individuality and competition so big in American society, that's a great like 3-hour documentary on it.
Ooh.
Awesome. Yeah.
Did really quick just want to make a point of, we did talk a lot about, inclusion as far as people of color, women of color, people on the gender scale, all of that. I'd also like to really just take a second to take everything that you've heard here, and we've really only grazed the surface of folks who are having these issues. We have, I think someone just brought up in the chat, making space more able, inclusive, and thinking about those other things that maybe we're not actively speaking about as loud as we are currently about these things, which I'm very grateful for, but like making spaces handicap accessible. And I know there are a lot of spaces that probably are, but also, we have people within our community that are just lost. They're lost on us because we don't, as able-bodied people, think about these things, but making sure that our spaces are inclusive to all, not just a matter of your gender identity, your sexual identity, your color or race or what ethnicity, but like, are places wheelchair accessible? Are we accommodating to folks who are still a part of our community, but have different challenges that they have to get through, whether that be like having, spaces that are accessible to those people, or people who are willing to maybe go around and assist these folks at events if it's necessary, things like that we don't think about in the communities that maybe aren't getting as much of a spotlight right now, and really wrapping it all together, because it's not just women, it's not just POCs, it's not just us queer folk, there's so many other people that also subsection into that, and really applying everything you've heard today to those issues as well. Because I would love to see, I know there's one, I think, very popular boy spinner that had gotten mentioned in a previous conversation that I had that is wheelchair bound. And like, what about folks like him? What about folks like that? And what are we doing to also make these platforms accessible to them? That's it.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I would be super excited to listen to a panel about that as well and hear more conversation around accessibility, discussions around ableism in our communities through an intersectional lens as well. So I just got a message from Kevin that I think we have 30 more minutes. And I thought our panel was just for an hour. So I'm waiting for confirmation on that. I don't know if our panelists have other obligations or places they need to be for the next 30 minutes. But if they don't, I want to stick around in this. Oh, yes, we have 30 more minutes if we want it. So
And I'm available if people want to reach out and be like, oh, I think I said something really inappropriate and somebody stopped talking to me, 10 years ago. We're in quarantine, we're in isolation right now. Is a very cool time it's okay for everyone to not be okay, because most of the time historically we've all had to be like, are you good? Yeah, I'm good. You good? I'm chipper. And you just have to be fine all the time. And the whole world is in a very vulnerable time right now. So, I'm available if you want to reach out. I'm certainly not speaking on behalf of everyone else. Maybe I should send people to Michaela. Be like, Michaela, you got to field all these uncomfortable discussions.
So
And
building,
people have, go ahead, Mel, go ahead.
just building off of, like we started to touch on accessibility issues, and I'm really glad that we actually have more time, because I felt like during the kinetic diversity panel, we like squashed that topic in the last like 30 seconds. And I just wish that there was more visibility for that. And so something I was going to say regarding that is that I would like to see the continuation of virtually hosted events. I think that's definitely going to happen. But that, I think, is a really good step for making things more physically accessible. Obviously, you have to have an internet connection and some power, but hopefully it opens up some doors for people who wouldn't necessarily participate otherwise. And another thing is I would like to see just more variation in the types of events we are holding in person. Like, not, most events don't have to involve you trekking your stuff through the dirt on uneven ground to go camp for 3 days in the hot sun. Like, we can have different types of venues and be more inclusive of people who would otherwise not participate if they had to go and overcome the barrier of camping somewhere for a weekend, because that's not for everybody.
Yeah.
I'll go for it, Sonal.
You go, girl, you go.
Oh, okay. So branching off of that, I think, thinking actively about representation and how that affects, accessibility, just the mental capacity of, I don't see myself reflected in this community. A, physically, if I don't see people that look like me, and then B, talking more or less about, are these settings something that everyone is comfortable with? Is this price range affordable for people across the board? Are there ways to offset that? Can we do, doing things like, if you have the ability to pay more so that someone can pay less, or you can sponsor someone who doesn't have the ability to do it for themselves, or, even just a simple act of, hey, I don't use these clubs anymore. Hey, I don't use this prop anymore. Is there someone who wants to start this journey and just hasn't been able to afford that luxury for themselves? Because the reality is props aren't cheap. as much as we'd like to, as much as someone looks at like my hoops and are like, oh, that's a child's toy, so it must be really cheap. They're not, especially when you start getting into multiples, like sets of clubs and juggling sets in general. I mean, they're not generally break the bank expensive for an average income, but when we're talking below the poverty line and the underserved communities, it is. And just being mindful in ways that you can personally feed into those groups of people, those demographics. And I know that I accrue tons of old hoops that I'll never use, and I've always been someone who's like, I'd much rather just pass it down to someone who wants it, who has the drive and the fire and just doesn't have the means to get one in this moment. And I think that's something that's very simple, just on a very, we can all almost achieve level of just, you know, it, as much as it's an accessible thing, it's not, that's not a reality for everybody. And I think those are the folks that we really need to be looking out for. So just making any type of adjustment to be conscious of that is really important.
Hoodie made an incredible DIY make your own poi video, and I thought it was going to be like, all right, let's get our sewing machines, and he was literally like, here's a sock, here's a potato, we're done. We're done, you know. And even like, I got some really shitty hoops, I got little Target hoops, you know. So how can we play with our environment? Like stats, this all started in like squats in France, right? And now it's like, hell yeah, I got my $125 Randy staff that I, you know, saved up for, and that was a birthday present, you know. But yeah, how to make accessibility for sure.
I want to throw out there too that the IJA has a program called Props to You, which is very underutilized, and I think if anyone's interested in reaching out about that program, either for receiving props or helping organize the distribution of that, it's out there as well. Cool. So I want to throw out a few things. One, we have a poll for everyone who's here. That'll go up pretty soon, and it's just for us to gather some information about who's attending, who's watching, your gender identity, and your age group. Oh, there it is. It had to be multiple choice, so I know not everything is included here.
Whoa. What the hell?
Oh, it's cool to see it update real time. That's great. And also panelists, we have about like 20 minutes-ish. Feel free to throw out your Instagram or social media handles and your Venmo. Sonal, I saw you had yours up already, just so people know where to find you, and to check out what you're doing in this world.
Oh, we're watching
that comment, Tina.
I was trying to click on something in the poll. Okay, that's very confusing. And Lucy, go.
I would just like to share kind of a maybe tangent story, but since I came out and transitioned, I like had sort of this very visceral experience of like what it's like to be perceived as male in like the world and as a juggler, and then the switch between like, oh, now I'm perceived as female, right? Like I use my unicycle to ride to the train station, right? When I was male presenting, the comments I got was, oh, that's cool, that looks hard, where's the other half, right? When I transitioned, the comments are, you look great, that's so hot, what else can you ride, right? So this, I think that a lot of people who don't experience firsthand, like you might have a perception of like, oh yeah, I bet catcalling happens. Like I know objectively that happens, but to experience it in such a like visceral way was, even though I knew it was a reality, it was very shocking, right? Like, I don't consider riding a unicycle to be a sexual act, but I can't tell you the number of times someone on the street has made me so uncomfortable, right? So like being aware that like these experiences that you might know, you might think you have knowledge of are a lot different than what you can imagine, right? So like in kind of like a throwback to like the conversation that happened on Juggling Home, like, hey, when I post a video, I get these creepy messages, I get DMs, I get hit on, right? So in that conversation, this guy was like, oh yeah, that happens to me too, right? But it's not the same. It's not the same at all. So it's, we need advocates, right, who have different experience, who can kind of give the benefit of the doubt to people who don't have as much privilege. I'm kind of losing my train of thought here, but
No,
it's,
Lucy,
it's very real.
This is exactly what I was just messaging Josie and Michaela about, that I would love to talk. This is like microaggressions. And then it's little things like this where somebody said like, I'm scared to wear shorts because, then it's uncomfortable. And if anybody's seen the BuzzFeed What Men Are Really Saying when they're catcalling video, it's very funny. And I feel like it's completely changed my experience of catcalling, because it's now that's all I hear, where these guys are like, I'm bad at sex, I'm really insecure. And now I almost, like, if somebody catcalls, I'll turn and be like, what's going on with you? Do you want to talk? Is it, let's unpack this. And I've had men like, what the fuck? And just like, whoa, she's in there. We're not supposed to engage, and especially not, if you get mad, they love that. They love that. But if you're like, are you okay? Are you okay, bud? It's like they will run the fuck away. But I mean, what is a microaggression? And what, Mel and Michaela?
Ooh, microaggressions, man, those are hard. Those are hard because what they are is literally just within itself. To like hide the aggression, you use something like a joke, right? It was supposed to just be funny. Like a very classic one that I'm sure we've all heard before, not necessarily directed at you, but as a brown woman, to hear that, I wouldn't have been able to guess because you sound so white, or you don't sound like you're black, and how that is supposed to come across as something positive, that I sound educated or articulate, which the other end of that is I don't anticipate or expect brown skinned folk to sound educated or be educated, because that's just what we've kind of inherently accepted as a bias that most of us live with. It's small things like that. So like saying like, oh, you're good at juggling for a woman, or just these things that like you really have to take a second to unpack what you actually mean, and be sure that that is what is coming out of your mouth, because it's very easy to be someone who thinks they are giving a compliment, or thinks they're being positive, or trying to connect with someone, while simultaneously being harmful and rude as fuck. It's just a matter of truly like thinking about what you're actually trying to say, because sometimes this and this are just not on the same page.
And try to have fun with it, where it's like, oh wow, this is trigger. Ooh, this is a learning opportunity. Are we about to have a teachable moment? Teachable moment.
Moment.
Because It is. It's exhausting. Yeah, I had somebody at a party, we're outside, and he's like, if I close my eyes, you sound like a white girl from the suburbs. And I'm like, okay, objectively not true. Kind of raspy ass white girl do I sound like? And what's a brown girl supposed to sound like? And I watched in real time as his pea-sized brain exploded. And he's like, It's like, yeah, what am I supposed to sound like? Durka Durka? Bitch? That was, but it's like, it's not our responsibility to like have the clap back every time, and it's like, how do we learn and evolve? Mel, I'm sure you got some good ones. Give us some.
Well, I was going back to the poll, actually. I'm looking at the poll results, and I just wanted to, like, talk about, like, how can we maybe have even been more inclusive on our poll, because anytime it comes to, like, having to classify yourself as something, that's not going to work for everyone. So, like, if somebody decided that they didn't want to answer the poll, or if they marked other because what they identify as isn't here on the poll, if you would like to share, I just wanted to make space for people to put that, like, to share what they would have preferred to have seen, or maybe what they identify as if they didn't identify with one of the options that we put here.
Yeah, and I will say I created the poll question, so that was on me. And I'm open to all feedback on that. Yeah. Oh, and I did an age group one too that I guess is going out now.
Yeah, and I mean, it's how can we empower each other to be vulnerable, because it's like there's no right or wrong. There's just forward, which can look like a spiral or look like it's going backwards. We're all learning. So how do we create spaces and have fun with the tough stuff? How do we do that? Because I feel like people are just really scared to make mistakes and really scared to, oh God, there's a brown person. Just don't talk to him because you don't want to say anything wrong, instead of like, how do we guide each other to.
And piggybacking off that, definitely, if you're one of those people who feel scared or weary or unsure of how to speak about these things with your friends of color or of other demographics that you maybe don't identify as with yourself, I always think a thumb of rule is going into it with an open mind, the ability to hear the experience that the other person has and not argue it is probably the best thing you could do. If you're truly coming into the situation to try to gain perspective and learn, you have to show up that way. Making someone argue about their existence or their reality is only going to end in an argument, and probably not a good one, not a fun one. So really just be open to learning, be open to listening, be open to having to possibly change your mind about something. And if not completely changing your mind, understanding that someone's experience is not relative to yours at all, and being okay with that. It's a scary topic, but if you come at it from the right stance, there will be a lot of understanding. There can be a lot of healing. There can be a lot of important things that happen in that scary place. And again, a lot of us, women, persons of color, generally exist in this scary space. We live here. We live in this scary space. So I'm sure most and all of us would welcome anyone who wants to try to understand or learn from those experiences. You just gotta come into it knowing that your reality does not change my reality, and my reality is probably not even relatively similar to yours, and that there sometimes will be mutual ground, and sometimes there's going to be things that we both can't understand from each other, because that's just our realities. We all live such different realities. And that's such a fucking trip that literally everyone's experience on this panel is so different from the next. And that there is something so beautiful in that, but there's also a lot that we have to like come together and just learn and be comfortable with. So, you know, if you're scared, awesome. That means you should act on that. If you're scared, that's normal. But branching out and really feeling and experiencing that scary is important.
It's a great comment from Nathan, because
Natan.
it is go ahead, Mel. You gonna say
It's
something?
Natan.
Natan. Does it feel tokenizing or empowering? And maybe it varies based on personal preference, because, you know, how do we reclaim our power in every, you know, we just give our power away. We just give it away. Just give it away. And how do we reclaim? I mean, as a stand-up, it's a big sausage fest, and you will get brought on stage. Like, our next comic is a woman, so she's probably on her period, you know, there's a pretty high chance, so get ready for that. and you know, you can either be like, can really affect your set, or you can be like, cool, I'm used to that. You're give it up for your host and his tiny little dick. But that's also like taking other people down. I don't know, it's hard. How do you empower yourself without taking other people down? Mel, were you gonna say something?
I was a couple instances come to mind. I definitely think that for a lot of us, it does feel tokenizing to have that be like the selling point for somebody. Is that like, I'm female, you know, and especially if it's in the role of something that has the image of being traditionally male for whatever reason. Like, I mean, there's a good quote from Brody from the Distillers, when like the Distillers were really popular and everyone's like, oh, Brody, you play guitar so well compared to other women. And it's like, why do you got to compare me to other women? Why don't you just compare me to guitarists in general, you know? And a friend of mine who is a DJ and manages a electronic music record company had this like funny thing where she also posted something on her Facebook that was like, hey everyone, drop your favorite male DJs in the comments below. And like, a lot of people got it, but a lot of guys were also like, oh yeah, this is my favorite male DJ, check out this guy and this guy and this guy. And it's like, okay, that went over your head, you know? Which just goes to show that it's very normalized for people to be like, oh yeah, this thing, you would only recognize it if you, I guess, directly experienced it. And the irony is kind of lost if you don't experience that issue.
And it will, you know, like, if I walk into an event and I'm like, damn, there are no brown people here, and then you want to say something like, you're so obsessed with race, that is a reflection of you have the luxury and the privilege of not being obsessed with race, and that you don't have to see that stuff ever, you know, because it's boring. It's boring to be doing like counting the browns. 0. it's you know, and yeah, Michaela, were you gonna say something?
I just think it's just something that's kind of ingrained. That's like the first thing that runs through my mind when I'm looking at the group of folks that I'm around. Like, it just inherently happens. I try to look for familiar faces, and it's just kind of like I don't really have to think about it. It's easy for me to decipher, yo, are there any other Minority Report? Is there anyone else here? And usually, because there's not many, it's pretty easy to come to that decision. But just, yeah, it's weird that people try to make it you're obsessed with race, when the reality is I'm brown. Like, my life is kind of about race, unfortunately, mostly because that's just how society has been built and how we function on a mental basis. So I just find it's funny because, yeah, again, we live in this scary place. POCs live in the scary place of having to be hyper aware of race and what our race generally means to the public eye. So it's weird because people try to pick you apart for just fucking existing as who you are. So that's just a thought.
And let's not forget, men traumatize each other all the time, you know. And I mean, Lucy, you have such a valuable experience. Like you assigned male at birth, and then I mean, I don't know at what age or what point you started to feel the shift, and now people will just look at you now and be like, oh, you're a woman now, you know, like, good for you. And you don't see the process. You don't see the process and at what point, you know. So to have the two perspectives, I think is really interesting. And I mean, I don't know if there's anything else that you wanted to share in terms of like the way that men must be microaggressing and macroaggressing on each other all the time, you know, and will feel really unsafe around each other, or unsafe to express vulnerability. Oh, you're muted.
Unmute.
There you
Okay,
go.
can you hear me? Yeah, what Joseph just said in the chat, society trains men to be assholes, that's 100% true. Like, when I was young, my natural expressions were very feminine, and I got bullied constantly for walking, standing, talking like a girl, right? And in order to protect myself, I was like, oh, I have to pretend to be a boy. And the model that I looked at and saw was, oh, I'll just be a jerk to everyone, right? And like, that's the way to like fit in and feel safe within that male peer group, is to be an asshole, right? So it's very true that like some of the comments say the patriarchy screws everyone, it hurts everyone. And like, what it does to men is heartbreaking and tragic in a way that's less obvious, right? So like, because you don't have as much of a real physical threat, and the things that are going to happen to you as a man are in by some measures less intense, right? Like, you don't have the level of fear of sexual violence, or like a lot of the concerns that are so unavoidable as a woman are like subtler for a man. You're just going to get called a sissy or a faggot, and you might get like beat up, but it's got a different like flavor of threat and violence behind it. So it's easier to just like internalize that as a guy, and then like you don't see it, and then you perpetuate it, right? So, you know, I try to have a lot of compassion for the male experience, because I experienced it, and it shut me down. I was closeted till I was like 32, because, and I still have a lot of fear of men from being around men as someone perceived as a male, and just feeling constantly unsafe. So like, you know, those are very real points.
And
So I just want to call out that we have 1 minute left, and we're at like the precipice of so much good conversation and so much content. But we're at the end of our time. If anyone has like, I don't know, 10 seconds each of a closing statement, not to like rush through it all. Obviously we could talk for the rest of Club Fest about these things.
Closing statement: women's rights means human rights.
I also just want to piggyback. I think that's also something I'd love to see in the future. I do want to acknowledge that there are a lot of struggles that male-bodied people have to go through and internalize just from existing. I hope that you all take the points that you've heard here today and use this as a tool to start supporting each other in the way that you need to support each other, so that you can show up for the rest of us the way that you need to show up. And we're here to support you 100% of the way if that's how you choose to do it. And again, I hope to see just a lot of positive change come from this in the future.
So I want to say that every time I have one of these types of discussions and it's kind of on a time limit, I'm always like, you can't put a time limit on this. We have so much to talk about. We can't possibly cover it all. But I understand, like, obviously it's logistics. That being said, I look forward to seeing more of these types of things being more visible and given the space to happen. And also, don't tokenize us and don't use it as leverage for your marketing and be like, we have diversity, come to our thing, give us money because we're diverse. You know, like there's definitely a fine balance there. I wish we had more time to even kind of unpack that and talk about it more. Obviously, we're out of time. But that being said, if anybody wants to reach out to me for further discussion, I am available to talk about this kind of stuff. If you want to message me privately.
All right, Lucy, any final things, thoughts?
I would just echo that. Like, it's not good to put the work of education on people, but I am happy to like have private conversations, answer questions. So yeah.
Awesome. So thank you so much, panelists, for your labor, your vulnerability, showing up here, communicating for weeks before this moment. I appreciate you all so much. And this has made me really happy. Thank you for the 117 people who've tuned in and stuck with us, or the questions in the chat. Reach out to me or the panelists who have offered that. Venmo them if you want to. And enjoy the rest of your Club Fest, everybody.